She is nothing but a parasite who spends all day at home playing computer games instead of working.
At my in-laws' house, during Christmas gatherings with relatives, my husband badmouths me while sipping a beer.
Not only that, but she's a terrible cook, lousy at cleaning, and doesn't even make the house relaxing to come home to. Honestly, having such a useless wife makes me sick.
His father, sitting next to him, listens with a laugh and says, "I see." But the mood among the other relatives is awkward. Some even openly grimace at his words. A few relatives, unable to bear the sheer cruelty of his remarks, softly say things like, "That's enough now." But he still doesn't stop. Feeling emboldened, he keeps spewing insults about me nonstop. Although I tried to let his words slide since we were in front of family, when he called me a parasite, I couldn't hold back my anger anymore. After all, it was me, working tirelessly as a programmer, who supported him when he quit his job because of workplace issues. The nerve of him, lounging around without even attempting to look for a job, yet having the audacity to call me a parasite. Unable to stay silent any longer, I stood up to respond, but my mother-in-law, rushing over in a panic, clung to my arm and whispered in my ear,
"Calm down. I know how hard you work, but it would be embarrassing if people found out that my son is being supported by his wife, you know? So, could you please endure this just a little longer?"
"Are you saying everything will be fine as long as I keep quiet and endure this?" I said, my voice shaking with anger. My mother-in-law quickly averted her eyes but didn't deny it. Meanwhile, my husband continued hurling insults at me, cheerfully drinking with his father.
Seriously, I just want to divorce this parasite who spends all day gaming and finally set myself free.
The moment those words reached my ears, my patience hit its breaking point. I stood there with my fists shaking and my eyes wide with anger. Then, I yelled at my husband, "Fine, I'll give you exactly what you want. Let's get divorced." My name is Vanessa Anderson, and I'm 28 years old. I work as a programmer for an IT company. My husband, Kenny, is 4 years older than me at 32. He used to work full-time at a major corporation. However, he left his job and is now working part-time while searching for a new position. Kenny was working without any issues when we first met, but after a while, he began struggling with workplace relationships and eventually quit his job a few years into our marriage. When he told me he was leaving his company, I was surprised, but since I had a decent income, I willingly supported his decision. I thought he'd take a short break, recharge, and then start fresh at a new job. However, Kenny, with his pride in having worked at a major corporation, had a tendency to set his sights too high for his next job. Because of that, his job hunting has been tough. "Aren't you supposed to be looking for a job?" I asked sharply, addressing Kenny, who was sprawled on the couch playing mobile games. For a while after quitting his job, he had been actively searching for work, but lately, he had even stopped trying. Now, he works part-time, making about $800 a month, and spends his free time lounging around and playing games like this. Kenny glanced at me briefly, then turned his gaze back to his phone, responding in an annoyed tone.
I am looking for it. It's just that no company out there can properly appreciate my abilities. It's not my fault.
Having faced repeated rejections during interviews, Kenny started blaming the companies for his inability to get hired. Gradually, he lost all motivation and has since stopped job hunting altogether. I put my hands on my hips, glaring at Kenny as he made his lame excuses. If you keep saying things like that, you're never going to find a job again. What are you planning to do if you can't get a full-time position?
Doesn't matter. You're earning money, so we're not struggling, right?
Hearing him shamelessly declare his reliance on my income, I stood there, dumbfounded, my mouth hanging open. Are you not embarrassed? If you were helping out with housework to support me, that'd be one thing. But all you do is sit around, contributing nothing, and live off my income.
What did you just say?
Kenny, who had been laughing and playing his game just moments before, suddenly scowled and glared sharply at me.
Do you know who supported you all this time? It's the husband's job to provide, and the wife's duty to support him during tough times. Don't you dare talk big to me again.
His yelling, high-pitched and frantic, reminded me of a stray dog. I watched him with a blank expression, realizing it was pointless to argue further, so I stayed quiet. But perhaps my silence only made things worse. Kenny continued treating me with a condescending attitude, never changing his behavior. By the time the year ended, Kenny still hadn't found a job, and I carried my frustration into the new year. Every Christmas holiday, it was customary for us to visit his parents' house. So that year, I went back to his family home with Kenny. The house was already full of relatives, some of whom had already gotten drunk and had flushed faces.
Kenny, you're late.
Walter, who was drinking with some other relatives, noticed us and called out loudly, waving Kenny over.
Dad.
Kenny's face lit up with joy as he rushed over to his father. Meanwhile, the moment I saw Walter, my face stiffened. Dragging my heavy feet, I reluctantly followed Kenny. Kenny admired his father, but to be honest, I couldn't stand Walter. Walter was a successful man, holding a managerial position at a well-known local company, but he was deeply sexist. He was the perfect example of how professional success doesn't necessarily translate to good character. Every time we met, he made condescending remarks toward me, and if it were up to me, I'd avoid him entirely. Still, I couldn't skip greeting my father-in-law for Christmas. Reluctantly, I spoke up. "Merry Christmas, Walter." Walter, who had been laughing up until that moment, immediately frowned at my greeting. Then, with a smug look, he snorted arrogantly.
You're still the same dull, uncharming daughter-in-law as ever. At least try smiling a little in gatherings like this. Can't you even manage a bit of charm as a woman?
I was disgusted by his outdated, sexist mindset, as always. To make matters worse, instead of defending me, Kenny joined Walter in criticizing me.
Honestly, Dad's absolutely right. She doesn't even know how to respect her husband, and she's completely lacking in charm.
Kenny had just taken a seat and was already gulping down beer, clearly starting to get drunk. With glazed eyes, he began loudly bad-mouthing me, feeling emboldened.
She's a terrible cook, horrible at cleaning, and the house isn't even relaxing to come home to. Honestly, having such a useless wife is exhausting.
Kenny continued insulting me with a smug grin and a boisterous laugh, clearly enjoying himself. Walter, sitting next to him, chuckled along and said, "I see," while listening, but the mood among the relatives was clearly uncomfortable. Some of them openly frowned at Kenny's behavior. Perhaps unable to endure his cruel remarks any longer, a few relatives tried to interject, saying, "Kenny, that's enough now." But he didn't stop. On the contrary, he went on to say something even more shocking.
And on top of that, She's nothing but a parasite who spends all day at home playing computer games without doing any work. Isn't that awful?
What? Until then, I had been listening to Kenny's words with a blank expression, trying to brush it off. But the sheer absurdity of his statement made me snap out of it and raise my voice. A parasite? What on earth is this man talking about? If anyone here was a parasite, it was Kenny, who lazed around without even attempting to look for a proper job. Then, to make matters worse, Walter, fully aware of Kenny's jobless status, added his own ridiculous remark.
Even so, Kenny is truly remarkable for providing for such a parasite. He's fulfilling his duties as a husband.
Thanks, Dad.
The two of them smiled as they poured beer into each other's glasses and happily continued drinking together. I watched them with utter disbelief, but I couldn't stay silent anymore. I stood up, ready to speak out. However, just as I opened my mouth, Kayla, my mother-in-law, rushed over in a panic. Clinging to my arm, she leaned in and whispered in my ear.
Vanessa, calm down. I know how hard you work, but it would look bad if people knew a husband was being supported by his wife. So, could you please hold back just a little?
Are you saying everything will be fine as long as I keep quiet and endure this? I asked, my voice filled with anger. Kayla quickly averted her eyes but didn't deny it. Meanwhile, Kenny kept hurling insults at me, laughing as he happily drank with Walter.
Honestly, I just want to divorce this game-addicted parasite and finally set myself free.
The moment those words left his mouth, my patience reached its limit. I stood there with my fist shaking and my eyes wide with anger. Then, with a face full of anger, I shouted at Kenny. Fine. I'll give you exactly what you want. Let's get divorced. My shout echoed throughout the room, stunning everyone into silence. Even Kenny and Walter, startled by my sudden outburst, stared at me with blank expressions. Taking advantage of the silence, I began correcting Kenny's ridiculous claims one by one. You've been calling me a parasite over and over. But if anyone's a parasite here, it's you.
What?
I'm the one supporting you with my annual income of $58,000 while you earn only a few $100s a month at your part-time job. Not to mention, you barely put any effort into job hunting and spend all day playing games on your phone. How dare you complain about me? Don't make me laugh.
Hey, you.
Kenny's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. After a moment, he seemed to recover from the initial shock and, with his face turning bright red, yelled back at me in anger.
Who do you think you're talking to like that? I'm your husband.
And what does being my husband have to do with anything? Besides, I already told you, I'm divorcing you. I glanced around at all the relatives, who were watching the situation unfold in stunned silence, and addressed them directly. I may spend my days in front of a computer, but that's because I work remotely. It's not because I'm playing games. Every day, I work hard at my job, take care of all the housework, and support the household in place of a husband who refuses to even try job hunting.
That's a lot.
The one who shouted was Walter, who had been quiet until now. His eyes burned with anger as he glared at me and desperately began claiming that everything I said was made up.
That's all a bunch of nonsense she just made up. There's no way a woman like her could earn $58,000 a year.
Hearing his words, I calmly pulled out my phone. I opened my company's website and navigated to the page showcasing employee achievements, where my interview article was featured. I held up the screen for Walter to see. The article included my photo and initials, making it impossible for him to claim it wasn't me. Does this give you a clearer picture of how much I contribute to my company? I said with a cheerful smile. Walter's face twisted with frustration, and he fell silent, clearly at a loss for words. At that moment, Kayla, who had been frozen in shock until now, suddenly snapped out of it. She grabbed my arm as if trying to diffuse the tension.
Come on, Vanessa. Why don't you come help me in the kitchen for a bit?
With a forced smile on her face, Kayla's expression made it crystal clear. She didn't want me to escalate the situation any further. But I coldly brushed off her hand. I'm divorcing him, so I don't see why I should feel obligated to help out in someone else's kitchen.
Vanessa, please don't say such things, all right?
If you need help, why don't you ask your son? Although, considering he's the one spreading lies about supporting me while playing games all day, I doubt he'd be much help.
Jeez.
Kenny gritted his teeth, unable to come up with a response, but he still refused to admit his lies. Squirming under the relatives' disdainful gazes, he began shouting nonsensical arguments.
You're only acting so high and mighty now, but you'll regret it soon enough. You're the one who will struggle if we get divorced.
Excuse me? I raised an eyebrow and let out an exasperated sigh. Had this man even been listening to anything I said? With my income and the fact that I already handled everything at home by myself, there was absolutely nothing for me to lose by divorcing Kenny. But judging by the smug look on his face, he genuinely seemed to believe I'd be in trouble without him. And why exactly would I struggle after divorcing you?
The fact that you've stayed here despite having an income is proof enough. If you hadn't left me yet, it means you'd be in trouble if you did. If you keep making such a fuss over nothing, I really will go through with the divorce. Are you sure about that?
Kenny's nonsensical logic was exhausting, and I didn't bother hiding my irritation as I replied. Yes, I'm sure. Feel free to go ahead.
What did you just say?
I haven't divorced you until now because I was worried it might hurt my chances of getting promoted. But that's not an issue anymore. So we can divorce anytime you'd like. I had a female supervisor at my company who was set to be promoted, but she went through a divorce just before the promotion, and shortly afterward, the promotion was called off. Hearing that story made me worry that if I got divorced, I might lose my chance at a promotion as well. But just recently, the project I had been leading was a success, and I've already been promoted. In other words, there was no longer any reason for me to hesitate about divorcing him. When I explained all of this, Kenny glared at me with a frustrated expression, grinding his teeth in anger.
Oh my God, Vanessa, you've been promoted despite being a woman? That's amazing.
Kayla clapped her hands together and said this cheerfully with a big smile. While it was nice to be complimented, I couldn't help but doubt the sincerity of her words. She was probably just trying to lighten the mood and intentionally putting on a bright front to smooth things over. Smiling as she said things like, "Working women are so inspiring," Kayla approached me again. Then, still smiling but with her brows slightly furrowed, she spoke in a pleading tone.
But if you go through with the divorce, won't it become harder for you to work, Vanessa? And Kenny would struggle without someone to support him. Could you reconsider and not go through with the divorce?
So this was how she really felt. I sighed deeply. I was about to firmly reject Kayla's request, but before I could, Walter's angry voice cut through the room.
What nonsense are you spouting? We don't need a wife who dares to defy her husband. And a wife who prioritizes her job over housework is utterly disgraceful.
Kayla shrank back at Walter's outburst and fell completely silent. And after that, she didn't say another word. Kayla was always like this. She didn't mock me the way Walter did, but she couldn't oppose him and always ended up doing exactly as he said.
Kenny, you should just dump a wife like her.
Well, but Dad.
While Kenny faltered under Walter's pressure, I reached into my bag, pulled out the divorce papers, and began filling them out right then and there. Seeing this, Kenny's eyes widened in shock.
Why do you even have divorce papers?
I prepared them so I could divorce you anytime. I'm so glad I brought them today. Ignoring Kenny's bewilderment, I calmly filled out the necessary details and signed the document. Then, I handed it to Kenny. Here you go. Kenny hesitated, his face sour, but unable to back down, he took the papers. With a scowl, he quickly scribbled down his information, then threw the papers back at me in a huff.
There. Happy now?
Yes, very happy. Thank you. I replied with a bright smile, which only made Kenny click his tongue in frustration.
Now that you've got what you wanted, get out of here. And send all my stuff over to me.
You don't need to tell me twice. I'll leave right away. Well then, goodbye, everyone. With a cheerful tone, I said my farewells and strode confidently out of the room, leaving the stunned group of relatives behind. That day, when I returned my home, I grabbed a large cardboard box and began packing up Kenny's belongings one by one. I wanted to erase every trace of him from my life as quickly as possible. I arranged for movers to pick up the larger items first thing in the morning, and finally, I could take a deep breath. Looking around the room, now almost entirely free of Kenny's things, I let out a long sigh of relief. That feels so much better. It felt as though I had finally gotten rid of the garbage I had been holding onto for far too long. Feeling refreshed, I stretched and began enjoying the start of my new life on my own. The next afternoon, as I was leisurely having lunch, my phone suddenly rang. Pausing my meal, I glanced at the caller ID and frowned when I saw the name displayed. It was Kenny, the last person I ever expected or wanted to hear from again. I could have ignored it, but I decided it was better to deal with whatever he wanted and get it over with. Reluctantly, I answered the call. Hello?
So, have you reflected on your actions yet?
Kenny's arrogant tone hit me the moment I answered. I had no idea what he was talking about, so I asked bluntly. Reflected? On what? He clicked his tongue in annoyance, and I could feel his frustration coming through the phone.
On filing for divorce, of course. If you apologize right now, I might reconsider and take you back.
I couldn't believe he was still saying things like this. Letting out an exasperated sigh, I replied calmly. I already submitted the divorce papers this morning.
What did you say?
Also, I hired a moving company and had all your stuff sent out. It should arrive tomorrow, so make sure to take care of it.
You did all that without asking me? What the hell?
What are you talking about? You're the one who told me to send your things. I just did exactly what you asked.
You stubborn and logical woman.
Kenny muttered in a low growl, and then, as if trying to save face, hurled one last insult at me.
You're such a boring, unladylike woman. You'll never find someone to marry you again.
It was clear Kenny was desperately trying to get the last word and win the argument. But at this point, nothing he said could bother me in the slightest. In fact, the more he spoke, the more I found myself thinking, what a pathetic man. Whether I get remarried or not is none of your business. And since it seems like you have nothing important to say, I'm hanging up now. I calmly brushed off his insults, ended the call without waiting for a response, and immediately blocked his number. A week later, while working from home, the sound of the doorbell made me look up. Wondering who it could be, I checked the monitor and saw an unexpected face. Kayla?
Hello, Vanessa. I'm sorry to show up unannounced. Could I come in for a moment?
Kayla stood there with a nervous expression, speaking hesitantly. I wasn't particularly eager to entertain her, but I couldn't just send her away without hearing her out. Reluctantly, I opened the door and invited her inside. While I prepared tea, Kayla sat in silence, her gaze fixed downward. When I sat down across from her, she timidly held out a box of sweets.
I'm truly sorry for all the trouble I've caused you, Vanessa.
I was surprised that she came all this way just to apologize. But as Kayla glanced up at me nervously, she continued speaking.
And, well, I have a favor to ask of you.
A favor? As I had suspected, Kayla hadn't come solely to apologize. It was clear that this favor was her real reason for visiting. Feeling a sense of dread, I reluctantly asked what it was. I can't imagine what kind of favor you'd ask of me, but what is it? Kayla hesitated for a moment, seemingly gathering her resolve before looking up with a determined expression.
I'd like you to remarry Kenny.
I stared at her in disbelief, my eyes wide. I had just finalized a divorce, and now she was asking me to remarry him? Kayla looked at me with pleading eyes, but as I gazed back at her desperate expression, I felt my irritation rising. After everything Kenny put me through, which Kayla witnessed firsthand, how could she stand there with just a box of sweets and ask me to remarry him? The sheer audacity was infuriating. Anger bubbling up inside me, I glared at her with disdain and said, "Is this supposed to be some kind of joke?" Kayla flinched at the coldness in my voice but didn't give up. With tears welling in her eyes, she began pleading for Kenny's case.
I know you're angry, Vanessa, and you have every right to be. But as things stand, I just feel so sorry for him.
After my fight with Kenny and storming out of his parents' house, Walter reportedly praised Kenny, saying, "You did the right thing getting rid of that insolent wife." However, as Kenny continued living at home and only working part-time, Walter began calling him a parasite and useless. When Walter found out that Kenny had tried to reconcile with me, he reportedly flew into a rage, shouting, "Stop doing something so unmanly."
Originally, Walter was proud of Kenny for landing a job at a major corporation, but he was furious when Kenny quit without consulting anyone and started working part-time. Lately, he keeps bringing it up and saying cruel things to Kenny about it.
Kenny, who had always been validated by his father, became confused and frustrated when Walter started completely rejecting him. Eventually, his frustration turned into anger, leading to clashes between the two. However, Kayla, who had always been looked down upon as a stay-at-home wife, had no voice in the matter. To make things worse, Walter shifted the blame onto her, yelling, "It's your fault for raising him this way." As a result, the atmosphere in the house became unbearable. Kayla, who has endured constant insults from Walter, being called a useless person who can only do housework, wore a visibly stiff expression whenever she spoke about him. Though she had always complied with Walter's demands, it was clear from her demeanor that she had grown tired of it.
But if you come back, Vanessa, I'm sure Kenny will start job hunting again, and Walter's mood will improve. So please, Vanessa, remarry Kenny.
Her utterly selfish plea filled me with disgust. Despite experiencing firsthand how poorly Walter treated her, she seemed to have no concern about me being subjected to the same treatment. There was no way I could bring myself to do anything for someone like her, and the idea of remarrying Kenny was absolutely out of the question. Your family's issues have nothing to do with me. Please leave. I handed the box of sweets back to Kayla and spoke coldly. Looking panicked, she tried to plead with me, saying, "Wait," but I didn't give her the chance. I gently but firmly pushed her toward the door, effectively escorting her out of my house. If you really want to fix your situation, I'd recommend finding a lawyer who specializes in middle-age divorce. Offering this single piece of advice as a parting courtesy, I mercilessly shut the door in her face, leaving Kayla standing there with a look that said she was on the verge of tears. 3 days later, another uninvited guest showed up at my house. As usual, I was working remotely when I noticed the sound of someone jiggling the handle of the front door. For a moment, I thought it might be a burglar, so I carefully kept watch. Then, my doorbell started ringing repeatedly, almost frantically. Wondering what on earth was happening, I checked the monitor, only to see Kenny's face twisted with anger glaring back at me. Relieved it wasn't a burglar, but equally annoyed, I reluctantly pressed the intercom's talk button. "What do you want?"
Hey, why did you change the locks? Open the door right now.
The earlier sound of the handle rattling must have been Kenny trying to unlock the door. However, I had already replaced the locks with new ones, so his old key wouldn't work anymore. I had changed the locks immediately after our divorce, and now I couldn't be prouder of that decision. "There's no way I'm opening the door. What are you even talking about?"
Don't mess with me. I'm your husband.
"You were my husband. Now you're just a stranger. And I don't plan on letting strangers into my house. So go home already."
If we remarry, I'll be your husband again. I'm willing to take you back, so open the door.
It sounded like a bad joke, but unfortunately, Kenny's face showed he was completely serious. Frustrated by my ex-husband's sheer stubbornness, I shot back in a sharp tone. "Are you still spouting such nonsense? There's no way I'm remarrying you."
Why not? I'm telling you I'm willing to remarry you. You should be grateful and agree.
Even in this situation, Kenny refused to drop his condescending attitude. While I found him unbearably irritating, I had to admit his unshakable self-confidence was almost impressive in its own way. Seeing that Kenny genuinely didn't seem to understand anything, I sighed and turned the question back on him. "If you were in my position, would you want to remarry someone like yourself? Someone who barely looks for a job, doesn't do housework, and mocks their hardworking partner by calling them a parasite. Who would want to stay with a person like that?"
Shut up. A woman's job is to stay quiet and obey her man.
"I'm so done with that sexist mindset of yours. Let me guess, you had a falling out with your father and ran away, didn't you? If living at home is so unbearable, why don't you try living on your own?" At that, Kenny, who had been glaring at me through the monitor, suddenly averted his eyes and looked slightly downcast, mumbling under his breath. I was about to ask what was wrong when he hesitantly spoke up, struggling to get the words out.
Well, I don't have any income.
I was puzzled by his words. I could understand having little income, but having no income at all? What was he talking about? Before our divorce, Kenny had been working part-time a few days a week, so he should have at least some income. As I wondered what he meant, Kenny finally confessed, as if realizing there was no point in hiding it any longer.
When I said I was going to my part-time job, I was actually skipping work to play poker. I kept taking days off without telling anyone, and eventually I got fired.
Are you serious? Hearing this for the first time, I couldn't help but let out an exasperated sigh. So you weren't even going to work and were just playing around? And you hid the fact that you got fired? That's unbelievable.
I was going to explain everything on payday, but then you started making a fuss about divorcing me, so…
Even now, was he seriously trying to shift the blame onto me? I no longer had the energy or will to say anything. I emptied my mind completely, letting his nonsense flow past me without reaction.
Anyway, that's why I can't even rent a place right now, so I came back here. You understand my situation now, right? Just open the door now.
Kenny, fully resigned yet acting arrogant, sat back as if he were entitled to my hospitality. Yes, I understood his situation perfectly. But how could he possibly believe I would take him back because of it? Even now, I couldn't wrap my head around his thought process. All of this is your own fault. Why on earth would you think I let you back in because of that?
What did you say?
Like I said before, I'm not letting a stranger into my house. Don't ever come here again.
Don't mess with me. I went out of my way to come here for you.
Kenny kept ranting, but I ignored him and ended the intercom call without hesitation. He became even more enraged and started violently kicking the front door. As he kicked the door, he shouted things like, "Open up!" and "Don't mess with me," causing a commotion. By this point, I knew this was no longer something I could handle on my own. Without hesitation, I called the police. It turned out that other residents had already called them as well, because shortly after, I could hear the sound of a police car's siren approaching. Realizing that a patrol car had pulled up outside my building, Kenny panicked and fled. When the officers arrived, I explained the situation to them. They assured me they would increase patrols in the area for a while. Their efforts paid off, as Kenny never showed up at my home again. Having failed in his plan to remarry me, Kenny apparently went to Walter's workplace next. There, he caused a scene, demanding that Walter give him a job. Walter, who prided himself on his reputation and outward image, was furious at being humiliated in such a public way. Even when Kenny begged, saying he was jobless and homeless, Walter refused to believe him and threw him out of the house. I have no idea where Kenny is living now, abandoned even by Walter, but honestly, I couldn't care less. I had been enjoying my peaceful single life, but one day, I witnessed something surprising at the local grocery store. There, behind the register, was Kayla, clumsily operating the cashier. Noticing my unwavering gaze, Kayla suddenly looked up and glanced in my direction. When she saw me, her face showed a look of surprise as well. However, since she was in the middle of her shift, Kayla didn't say anything. With an awkward expression, she averted her gaze and went back to operating the register. I never would have expected Kayla, who had always been a stay-at-home wife, to start working at her age, but it might be better for her to stay busy rather than being cooped up at home. but something about the sadness on her face nagged at me. So, I decided to wait until she finished her shift to speak with her. "Kayla, it's been a while." Kayla emerged from the employee exit, her face looking utterly exhausted, and turned around in surprise when she heard my voice.
Vanessa.
"I didn't expect to see you working." I was really surprised. At my words, Kayla gave a weak smile and slowly began to explain her situation. Apparently, after Kenny's antics caused Walter to become a laughingstock at his company, Walter began taking out his stress on Kayla. The verbal abuse she had endured before grew even worse, and eventually, Kayla couldn't take it anymore. She rented an apartment and started living with Kenny. "I heard Kenny was kicked out, but I didn't realize you left the house with him."
Yes, but even after we started living together, Kenny refuses to work, and on top of that, he dumps all the housework on me. He says I should be able to find a job even at my age, so I'm the one working while he just stays home and plays around. Honestly, it's not much different from when we were living at home.
Kayla chuckled bitterly as she spoke, her laughter tinged with self-mockery. Hearing about her terrible situation, I couldn't help but frown. I hadn't expected Kenny's rotten behavior to change, but I never thought he would stoop so low as to freeload off his elderly mother.
Thank you for talking to me, Vanessa, even after all the trouble I caused you. It means a lot to me. I'm so sorry for everything.
After saying that, Kayla quietly turned to leave. But I grabbed her arm, and as she looked at me in confusion, I locked eyes with her and spoke firmly. "Kayla, let's go to a real estate agent right now."
What?
Pulling her along despite her surprise, I led her to a nearby real estate office. While she stood there, stunned, I searched for a small apartment suitable for a single person and helped her sign a lease. Kayla looked completely bewildered by how quickly everything happened.
Wait, Vanessa, what exactly is this?
"You need to cut ties with Walter and Kenny." Kayla was left speechless by the decisiveness of my words. Taking advantage of her silence, I began trying to persuade her. "As long as you stay with those two, you'll never find happiness. I'll introduce you to a lawyer. Divorcing Walter is the best option for you. And as for Kenny, you need to stop enabling him. Let him figure out how to live on his own. If you secretly move into the place we arranged today and cut off all contact, even Kenny will have no choice but to start taking care of himself." Even after everything I said, Kayla seemed a bit hesitant. But after a moment, she nodded as if she had made up her mind. In her eyes, there was a newfound strength I had never seen before.
You're right. I'll do it. Thank you, Vanessa.
I'm glad I could help. I smiled and shook her outstretched hand firmly. To be honest, there were moments when Kayla's behavior had frustrated and angered me, but I didn't dislike her as much as I did Walter or Kenny. She was a victim of that household as much as I had been, and I couldn't bring myself to abandon her entirely. All I could do was hope that Kayla, now free from the shackles of family, would finally reclaim her life. Later, I heard from Kayla that Walter had stubbornly resisted the divorce, shouting, "I'll never allow it." But with the help of her lawyer, she was eventually able to finalize the divorce. As for Walter, now living alone, he couldn't handle housework and turned their home into something resembling a hoarder's den, spending his days in lonely isolation. As for Kenny, his situation wasn't much better. With Kayla suddenly leaving him, he found himself unable to manage his daily life. Now, he scrapes by with day labor jobs, living alone in an apartment that has also turned into a hoarder's den. As for me, I've been busier than ever since my promotion. I was still a bit worried that my divorce might affect my job, but it turns out that my female supervisor's lost promotion wasn't due to her divorce after all. Apparently, she had been having an affair with the department head, and when the company found out, her promotion was revoked. It's a rather anticlimactic story, but I have to admit I felt relieved knowing I no longer had to worry about it. The time I wasted living with Kenny is something I can't get back, but from now on, I'm determined to devote myself even more to my career.